So in this video, I want to talk about the compositional strategy to make sure you have nice clarity and depth within a loud framework. And that is actually creating space within the way that you compose the music itself. So I've come up with a very simple demonstration of this here. So what I've done is here, I've basically just filled up the space with long held kind of legato notes, whereas the initial idea was me jamming on the keyboard and creating space just by playing things at different times and trying to fit different elements around each other. So not having things playing on top of each other too much. You can see there's kind of little bits where things have got their own little space. Obviously there is overlap, the bass overlapping with the piano, especially in places, but there's a little bit of space within the arrangement. Whereas here, you can see that I've really just filled up the space with long block kind of held notes. Now, obviously, compositionally, this sounds awful with these long held notes. But, that being said, a lot of people, when they're starting out, fall into the trap of not having that kind of call and response within their music. So a massive part of music, if you listen to it, is the interaction between the elements and like little question and answer phrases within the music. And a lot of time when people are starting out, they just throw more things on top. It's not making me feel how I want it to make me feel. Another loop, another lead sound, another chord, and they just fill up and fill up and fill up. Whereas really they need to work on the core elements and get the core elements sounding even better to dial it in properly. So I want to demonstrate the effect that has on the clarity of the mix. Now let's just have a listen first of all. So we'll go through 8 bars of this kind of layered legato kind of approach and 8 bars of the idea where I just composed it to have a little bit more space. So focus on the drums, listen to the kick and the snare here. Transients, getting kind of clouded by the other elements playing on the top. Whereas here, it's much easier to be able to decipher the different elements that are playing. Now, obviously, simply from a compositional point of view, this to me is much more groovy and much more fun and has much more clarity and space to it than this does. So we wouldn't want to do this anyway because it sounds very boring. There's no variation, there's no contrast. But from a technical point of view, it causes huge problems for us as well. So I'm going to bring this up to a mastered level. So you might want to just adjust your listening so that it compensates. Maybe turn down your monitoring. And I'm also going to bring in an oscilloscope, which I will be using throughout this video series because it can tell us quite a lot of interesting stuff about what's going on in our music. This is the Pro L2 from FabFilter, a really nice limiter. So we're going to have a look at how the limiter is going to react to these two different ideas. So we'll crank up quite a lot of gain reduction. So I'm really going to push this so it's very much exaggerated. So I wouldn't normally do this. It's on a unity gain here, so I'm going to take that off. So we won't hear any change in volume that way, but I actually want to bring it up so we can see what's going on in the oscilloscope. Okay, so here we're hitting over 8 dB of gain reduction. So we're absolutely massacring this track way more than we should do. But this is just for the demonstration. I want to exaggerate it. Now, listen to the change in clarity and listen to the kind of change in the amount the limiter's having to work on these two different alternative compositions. Right, so you can see that when we have this layered kind of legato composition, the limiter's not able to recover because, as you can see, we brought the gain up to the point where we're actually bringing in some of the RMS information. We're bringing that up to the 0 dB full scale. So it's not actually able to recover in between because once the limiter's getting triggered, there's no space in between for the limiter to kind of recover. So it's constantly limiting the whole time because there's no space in the music. There's no gap. There's no silence in between. So the limiter's having to constantly be working. Now, that's a product of the fact that we've pushed this to the extreme, but this helps exaggerate the point a little bit more. Whereas when the track breaks to the second section, you can see there's actually a bit of a chance for the limiter to recover in between. The peak's not really changing, but in between it's able to pump. It's kind of dancing with the rhythmic elements of the track. So I would also say that the first section here is comparatively much more distorted sounding, much less clarity, much less depth. It's much more squashed, it's much more compressed sounding. So at equal volume, this one is suffering a lot more than this one, which, neither of them sound good because they're being massively over squashed. But comparatively, this one sounds much more natural, much less distorted, much more open, much less dense, much more clarity, whereas this one is really struggling. So the take home of this is that you need to create space in your composition. If you simply constantly load your track up with element after element, each one of those elements is going to have to be quieter to fit in, and you're going to hit that ceiling quicker. Whereas if you have space in the composition, you're going to have much more clarity for each sound to breathe, and also you're going to be triggering these dynamics processes, especially things like limiters, a lot less. They're going to have to do a lot less work because there's going to be periods of silence where they can actually recover to not having to do any processing at all. So when we're thinking purely about loudness, we need to make sure that these kind of maximizers that we have at the end of the chain are going to do as little work as possible, because if you start overcooking any of the limiting or dynamics processing, that's where you're going to really start to affect the groove of the track. You're going to bring up all the quieter elements really too far forward, so you lose that sense of depth, because remember the difference between the peak and the RMS is how we get that nice sense of depth. So you're going to lose your sense of depth, and you're going to have to overly soften your transients, because you can see here the limiter in between is not recovering, so all those kicks and snares are constantly getting squashed. It's very important to remember that a limiter is just a compressor, which is very, very responsive, very, very fast, and works on a kind of infinite ratio. But it will still change the overall groove of your music. So if you're asking a limiter to do a huge amount of limiting like this, then it will change the overall clarity of your mix and the depth of your mix. So from the very start, regardless of how loud you want your track to be, you need to aim to try and compose your track so there's space in there, and there's a kind of healthy interchange between the different sounds that are in there. Now, of course, there are types of music where everything is very, very layered. I'm quite a big fan of kind of shoegazy, indie kind of stuff. And sometimes that's very soundscapey, lots of layered sounds, lots of reverb. That may not be a genre where having kind of loud, clear, punchy mixdowns is top priority. But I would say even within that genre, having a nice interchange between the sounds, even within the context of the style, is going to be really, really useful. Now, just to have a look at the oscilloscope here, to have a look at the difference between these two things, you can see the kind of gaps in between relative to the just pure kind of sausagey thickness from the first idea. Let's have a look. So what you can see here is there's moments of silence here, and this is the 0 dB full scale limit here. And you can see a lot of the sound is falling below this. You can see this is the kind of kick drums here that are triggering it. And we're going to have a look at all this later at ways we can kind of gain some extra headroom without losing that sense of low frequency and punch, etc. But once again, just looking at the, let's just loop this section, looking at the initial kind of layered example. It's much thicker and there's much more which is kind of pushing up towards that 0 dB full scale limit, mainly due to the amount of limiting we've got going on. But if we are looking for a loud kind of master, then this second idea here with the space in it is going to be much easier for us to get loud and still retain a sense of clarity and a sense of punch. Obviously, that was exaggerated with Pro L2, but if we were, going for a tastefully loud master, this one is going to be much easier to get loud. Okay, so hopefully that principle's been presented to you clearly. You need to create space in your mix. If you're looking for a sense of clarity when you come to create your kind of loud mix down and master, you actually have to have a sense of clarity in the first place. That's basically the take home. If there's no sense of clarity in your composition, forget about it being loud with clarity, because there was no clarity in the first place. So this isn't good advice for loudness. This is just good advice. Create space, create contrast, create a healthy interchange between the elements, and you'll have a far greater result compositionally, mix down wise, and to create a loud master at the end. Okay, so now we've covered an important principle for composition to make a loud, clear mix. In the next video, we're going to talk a little bit about sound selection. So I'll see you then. Thanks for watching.